spoke with, well, maybe 3 or 4 months ago. They had a story that had, let's just say, upset. It was either a retirement home or a long-term care home. I can't remember which. But they had a reporting incident, and the long-term care home or retirement home had been quite cranky, and so we thought it would make sense to have a look in a bit more detail, try and work out what the mandatory reporting requirements are, and to look at some of the puzzles. I think before I even start, when you think about ethics or ethically challenging situations in healthcare. Let me ditch this phone call. When you talk about or think about ethics and ethically challenging situations in healthcare, often what we're talking about is a clash of two different principles. You know, on the one hand, you should do this; on the other hand, you should do something else. And those values or principles that underlie that clash come into conflict, and you've got to sort of navigate your way through that. There's another category, and I'm going to call it sort of a category of questions of judgment. So you can think about this in really general terms. If you think about any rule you like, there's always a puzzle about whether the rule applies in the particular situation that we find ourselves in. Okay, so this is a general puzzle. It's a question of judgment, and it's a question about the application of a rule. And we'll see how that sort of unfolds through this discussion. The key idea is that the rule doesn't carry its rules of application right on it. It's a second set of questions. So, but we'll get there. We are coming to you. We're based in London, so this is a London-based Antler River land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lunar-Piwak, and the Atawandarum. We acknowledge all the treaties that are specific to this area. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to society. This land acknowledgement is a first step, a small step, towards reconciliation. Awareness means nothing without action. It's important that everyone takes the necessary steps towards decolonizing practices. We encourage everyone to be informed about the traditional lands, treaties, history, and cultures of the Indigenous people local to their region. Let me do just a little aside. All of your organizations will have various forms of, I'll call it an IDAR commitment, so equity, inclusion, diversity, and anti-racism. And I think if you connect those IDAR commitments to the Ontario Health IDAR commitment, it's pretty clear that what is being promoted, expected, is not just that we break down barriers. So not just that we try to make healthcare as accessible as possible, but that we actively seek out the ways, or identify the ways in which certain groups, in this case here we're talking about certain groups with Indigenous backgrounds, have been both systematically excluded from healthcare and have been I would say the victims of healthcare practices. So it's not just a passive, we better not do that anymore. It's more an active, let's look to identify the ways in which we have created barriers. Let's remove them and let's reach out. Just the team's usual stuff. Use the chat. We're happy to interact. Aurelia, I think if people they can open their mics and jump in, right? I think that should work. But regardless, communicate with us. Use the chat. Chat will definitely work. Aurelia will monitor that if I'm not managing to, and she will cut in and will go the direction that you want. Well, maybe I should do my learning objectives. There you go. We're going to understand the mandatory obligations to report abuse and neglect. We're going to look at a challenging concept, this concept of, we're calling it vulnerable independence. So we're going to look at vulnerability and autonomy in the same breath. And that is, I think that is a real challenge. And then we'll look at some of the ethical implications of reporting. So this is an old story. I've used this story often. It was a small hospital in southwestern Ontario, and it's probably relevant to identify that in this small hospital, people knew each other. They knew each other as colleagues, and they knew their patients in the community. So the story was that the patient was elderly, or obviously unwell. The plan was that she would be discharged to her home, and it was a home that she shared with her daughter. As sort of preparation for that discharge home, she was sent home on an LOA, a leave of absence. The plan was that she would be at home with her daughter for a week, and then would return, and we'd work out what the final destination would be. Good so far? She get a nod. Yep, that's it. So within 24 hours, she was back in the hospital. And after a great deal of coaxing, I think might be a good word, a great deal of conversation with the social worker in this case, she explained what had happened. She said that she'd gone home, she'd not been home long, and she had fallen. She'd fallen in the passageway, the entranceway to the home. So inside the front door, but sort of in the hallway. And she couldn't get up. So she called to her daughter and she said, "Help," as one would. "I can't get up." And the daughter said, "Yes, you can." Go on, I needed some sort of reaction from somebody. "Yes, you can. Get up. You're just being lazy." And she said, "If you think you're going to come home here and treat me like a servant, you're dreaming. Get up." So after a couple of hours, patient lying on the floor, her daughter brought her a pillow and a blanket. After a couple more hours, she brought her a cup of tea. After a couple more hours, she changed her Depends. And 17 hours later, 17, you got the 17? A neighbor came over to visit and saw the old lady on the floor and called an ambulance, and she was brought back into hospital. So the social worker was outraged. I mean, just horrified. "You've been abused. You've been neglected. I want to call the cops." Okay, I think as we put a poll in. Has our patient been abused or neglected? And we're not doing maybes for any of these polls. You've got to give us a gut reaction before you've gut reaction. I'm going to call the police. Should the social worker call the police? So you've got two polls to answer there, and they're just yeses and nos. The patient said, "Don't you dare. Don't you dare call the police. Don't you dare interfere with the way in which I am living my life with my daughter. I want to go home. And if you start doing things like calling the cops, that's going to ruin any relationship that I might be able to have with my daughter, and I'll never be able to go home. I want to go home. So don't you dare." Does that make it different? What have I got for responses? What are people saying? No, I don't know. I can't see responses.
So the responses are yes, 83%, and no, 17%.
Okay, so most of you are coming down on the side that this person has been abused or neglected. Well, does it make any difference if she says, "Don't you dare call the police"? So let me park that. This is going to be, is the patient, I'm going to use the word capable, is she capable of making her own decisions? Yeah, I'm going to make her capable. Now, but I'm going to say to Darlene, we'll come back to this, because it's not necessarily, I think, always the case that judgment of capacity or non-capacity ends up being determinative. I think that's the word I want to use. So in this case, yeah, she's totally fine. And I put it on the slide, so it's a bit of a giveaway. She did say at the end, we've always been a stubborn family. My daughter was wrong this time, but on a different day, with the implication that on a different day she would be stubbornly lying there until somebody gave in and helped her move. So I think Darlene has captured one of the puzzles that is going to run through this entire conversation. There are maybe two parts to those sort of intertwined puzzles. One is, what difference does it make whether the person is capable of making their own decisions or not? And I think we're certainly going to end up exploring that. That's one piece. A second puzzle that's going to run all the way through this is a question about what we should do. What is the role of the care provider on the outside, looking from the outside to intervene, I was going to use the word to help. So the hospital concerned, the one that prompted this in the first place, we said, well, what about some scenarios? And they gave us these three. So an older adult patient lives with her older adult brother. Some staff believe that the brother is abusive towards the sister, the patient. There's no apparent evidence of abuse. Maybe you should pick up that theme. If I say that something is abusive, I've told you that it's bad. So the word abuse, the word neglect indeed, has got its moral evaluation, this sort of ethical component. There's no such thing as good abuse, is what I'm trying to say. It's embedded. If I call this action abusive or I call this situation abusive, I've morally evaluated it. However, I told you that those questions of judgment, how do we decide whether that label, abuse, is appropriate to any particular situation? What are the components of abuse that make it abuse? So one way of coming at this is to think about, maybe some of you will have heard me talk about this before, a subjective view and an objective view. I often talk about a subjective view of best interests. We could do a subjective view of abuse, and the contrast is an objective view. Subjective view is I get to define it. I get to define what counts as in my best interests. I get to define what counts as abuse in my life, in my story. Subjective view, dependent on the individual. The objective view is that there are external standards that apply to everybody. And if you do this, then it's abuse. Or if you're the subject of this, then you have been abused. And we can tell looking from the outside at your situation, regardless of what you say about it. You okay with the tension? Internal view of abuse or a subjective view, I get to define what constitutes my own abuse. An external view, no, there's an objective standard out there that says this type of action is inherently abusive. That's the territory that we're going to be spending our time in today. Okay, second scenario, resident from a long-term care home. Is admitted with multiple pressure injuries, wounds, and appears malnourished. And the third one, a family takes a patient out of their retirement home. The patient in this case is not capable, not providing the basic necessities for the patient. And then they advise the hospital discharge planning staff that the patient isn't able to afford a retirement home. So you've now got that patient in the hospital. The patient has a monthly income and the hospital believes the family is taking it for themselves while leaving the parent in the hospital. Sound familiar? Should be. I think I should be getting people nodding there. Oh, I need to do this. Not a lawyer. Do not take this as legal advice. Although we will certainly be talking about legislation and coming at it from an ethical perspective. Now, we're doing this session now. We were prompted by the idea that June is Seniors Month. So why am I going to talk about the Child, Youth and Family Services Act? The reason I'm going to talk about it is that when we think about mandatory reporting of abuse and neglect in particular, the first thing people think about is children. and reporting the reporting requirements around children. So this is straight out of the Act. There's a duty to report a child in need of protection. And then the Act goes on to list it. The list is longer than I've given you here, but physical harm or risk of physical harm, sexual abuse or risk of, that the young person requires treatment, that there's emotional harm or a risk of emotional harm, and then some others. So who has got that obligation? Anyone, including a person who performs professional or official duty. So that's the healthcare piece. Healthcare providers have got an obligation under the Child, Youth and Family Services Act to report to a Children's Aid Society a child in need of protection, which is defined as at risk of physical, sexual abuse or requiring treatment and so on. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to do that act is because it's at the very least interesting, instructive, I think, too, to look at the purpose of that act. The purpose, again, I'm lifting this straight out of or the first bullet is straight out of the act. The paramount purpose of this act is to promote the best interests, protection, and well-being of children. And I've highlighted best interests and well-being. I think what we're getting at here is that with children, our community, our society has recognized, I was going to say decided, I think recognized is a better word, recognized that we as a community have got a duty to nurture our kids, where nurture means sustain, try to give them the conditions that allow them to grow and develop. And that's a special obligation that applies to children because they're developing. Maybe also because they're vulnerable, but certainly because they're developing. And my note here is that the purpose doesn't mention an idea like autonomy or independence. It talks about best interests and well-being. The contrast is with the Healthcare Consent Act. The Healthcare Consent Act is an act to promote autonomy. Goes on to talk about best interests, but only when you get to about section 27, and only then after it has given you instructions for substitute decision makers to make the decisions that they've been instructed to make. So the Healthcare Consent Act is all about autonomy. And the contrast with the child protection legislation is that it's all about best interests and well-being. Now, go on, give me a nod. Is that distinction? Can you see why that's a big deal? Is what I'm trying to say. And one of the reasons I'm trying to capture that as a big deal is that when we talk about protecting the elderly, when we talk about elder abuse, it's really easy to slip into a way of thinking about old people as if they were children, and that we sort of export the duty to protect that comes with protecting children to protecting vulnerable adults. And what I'm trying to capture is that the legal foundation for protection here is completely different. We've got a very particular obligation in respect of children that we don't have in respect of autonomous independent adults, and that is puzzling in respect of adults who are particularly vulnerable. We'll come to that. Maybe the crucial piece it's worth identifying is that mandatory reporting overrides, supersedes our general obligation to maintain the privacy of a patient. So if you can think about sort of the logic of these steps here, when you are in a healthcare relationship with a patient or a client, that relationship is privileged, and the information that is shared as a result of that healthcare related interaction is confidential. That's the rule. That's the default for a healthcare relationship. What mandatory reporting does is it overrides that. It says, yeah, we get that you're supposed to keep this confidential, but in these particularly special identified circumstances, we require you to breach the normal rules of confidentiality. I changed this from the last time that I did it because I was having a conversation about this, and one of the physicians in the room said, well, what about reporting people who are unsafe driving? So if we're thinking about this mandatory reporting piece, we've been thinking about it in the context, or we came at it in the context of abuse and neglect. It's actually wider than that. So this is just a list of mandates, either legislated or as a result of a professional college. This rules that apply to physicians. So a physician has got an obligation to report to the Ministry of Transport people who are unsafe driving. Now, if you think about that obligation, that's a really big deal. That can strip away somebody's independence, their ability to live their own lives in their own place. And that's an obligation that's placed on physicians in order to protect the rest of the community. It may well be the case that removing somebody's ability to drive is really, really bad for that individual. But the obligation on the physician is an obligation that's grounded in a commitment to the community. Abuse and neglect for long-term care retirement home residents, will come to that. Sexual abuse of patients by registered health professionals, will come to that. But physicians have to identify births and stillbirths and deaths, communicable diseases, a loss from the office of a controlled substance, a community treatment plan, gunshot wounds, issues that relate to aviation, railway and maritime safety, occupational health and safety, issues associated with correctional facilities, preferential access to healthcare, healthcare fraud, privacy breaches, and the reporting of offences to the college itself. So it's quite a long list. And as you sort of flip through the list, you'll probably be thinking that the groundings are different, the foundational ideas. Why do we have to report this? Why does this issue supersede the general commitment to privacy? Sometimes it's to protect the individual. The child neglect and abuse reporting piece, I think, is the best example. Sometimes it's to protect the broader community. The driving piece is a better example. So, what are the foundations? Sometimes it's to protect the profession. So we'll come at that. Permitted reporting. So this is where you could override confidentiality. Disclosure to prevent harm. So that's clear risk to an identifiable person or group of persons, and there's a risk of serious bodily harm or death, and the danger is imminent. And you can also report, or if you're a physician, physician incompetence. So let's go more broadly. That lot was targeted at physicians. This is mandatory reporting that concerns adults. We've done the kid piece, and we're going to look at residents of retirement homes, residents of long-term care facilities, and reporting of healthcare professionals by healthcare professionals. So this is straight out of it's the Retirement Home Regulation Authority regulations. Anyone who sees or suspects a situation that harms or puts a resident at risk of harm must report it to the RHRA. And then it specifically identifies retirement home staff and operators, and regulated health professionals are obliged to report harm or risk of harm to a resident. And then abuse or neglect, the sort of the standard things that need to be reported, unlawful conduct, or misuse or misappropriation of a resident's money. So this is specifically, this applies to the residents of retirement homes. And the process is that those issues should be reported to the regulatory authority. In the Fixing Long-Term Care Act, there are similar requirements for reporting abuse and neglect for residents of long-term care facilities. So improper or incompetent treatment that resulted in harm or risk of harm, abuse of a resident or neglect, unlawful conduct that resulted in harm or risk of harm, misuse or misappropriation of a resident's money, misuse or misappropriation of funding that goes to the licensee. The obligation, maybe I'll put it up here, this The long-term care reporting obligation is to the director of the facility. And then the facility has got a duty, and the director of the facility has to report on to a long-term care inspector. So this is the duty of healthcare practitioners in those long-term who get this information concerning a resident of a long-term care facility. Even if the information is confidential or privileged, you have an obligation to report. And then it just lists the people who might be who would fall under that category. And there's a corresponding offence of failing to do that. So if you provide professional services to a resident in the areas of health, social work, or social services work in a long-term care facility, and you suspect abuse or neglect, you must report it. And there's an offence that an offence of not reporting that corresponds to that. Okay, so we've got mandatory reporting for residents of retirement homes, mandatory reporting for residents of long-term care facilities. This next move is different. Under the Regulated Health Professions Act, so if you are a member of a regulated college, then you've got an obligation to report any member of your college or any other regulated health profession college. You've got an obligation to report sexual abuse. So a member shall file a report in accordance with the previous section if the member has reasonable grounds obtained in the course of practicing the profession to believe that another member of the same or a different college has sexually abused a patient. Now, why? What is the foundation for all of these reporting requirements? And I think there are things that are worth identifying here. For the self-regulating professions, the healthcare colleges, it's really important that they maintain their reputation. So if you think about the way in which a self-regulating college works, what it does is it sets the standards of the profession, and it sets the barriers to entry to the profession. So not just anybody can call themselves a doctor or a nurse or a physiotherapist or a social worker. You have to go through the process of education and standards that the college, self-regulating college, has laid down in order to be a practicing member of that protected discipline. And there's a great deal of value in that. You can't get paid as one of those unless you're a member of the college. So the college itself has got any of the regulated health professions colleges has got a vested interest in ensuring that it maintains its own standards, and that's why that sort of piece of reporting is important. I should probably identify that that ethicists are not regulated health professions, and anybody can call themselves an ethicist. So yeah, that was a go right ahead. So if we're protecting the profession, sexual interaction between a healthcare professional and a patient or a client is ruled out as inherently abusive. Now, you can all think of loads of examples where there would be situations where a sexual relationship between a member of a regulated health profession and a client or patient indeed was not abusive, but that's not the question. The question is it contrary to the regulations of the profession? Yes, it is, because the professions absolutely want to protect their image. Now, I think there's a similar question to ask about the function of reporting for long-term care homes and retirement homes. So for certain, there's the requirement that we protect the people who are in those facilities, but there's also the requirement that we maintain confidence in the system, confidence in the care standards and safety of retirement homes and long-term care facilities, the places to which we commit. don't know if that's the right word. One sense of it is right. Members of our community that are often far more vulnerable than many others. The reporting piece also carries with it some leverage, some enforcement. So for long-term care homes and retirement homes, they've got licenses. They're overseen by government agencies, and maintaining the standards are conditions of licensing. Same for healthcare professionals, they've got licenses. So maintaining the standards of the professions, condition of that license. However, and we're sort of getting to the stuff that is, I would say, way trickier. In my home, I don't need a license to provide care. I don't have to go through any training. Maybe it would have been a good thing. I don't have to go through any training to have children and to bring them up, nor indeed to care for any of my relatives and friends as they become increasingly vulnerable. The leverage that we have, I think, is all the way over here in the criminal code. So if you like, the leverage, the way we've got to intervene to maintain standards in long-term care homes, retirement homes, pretty clear. We got that. What leverage is there outside of that in my home? Well, maybe we're stuck having to go all the way to the criminal code. So now we're in this grey stuff. We're in the neglect and abuse categories. What does that mean? We know they're bad, but what are they? What's their relationship to a notion of capacity? And what happens when people are intrinsically? No. What happens when people are especially vulnerable? So just setting up some of the boundaries that come from the criminal code here. So these things are illegal. So it sets a boundary on the way in which people can interact with each other. Physical assault, sexual assault, unlawful confinement, failing to provide the necessaries of life, theft, fraud. All of those are criminal offences. Now, is there an obligation to report a criminal offence or your suspicion of a criminal offence? And here I think you should be thinking, obligation, mandatory obligation. Would reporting a criminal offence override your obligations to confidentiality? And I think you're going to be immediately thinking, oh, that's tricky. No. You'll have a pile of situations where you may well be providing care to somebody who has committed a criminal offence, but there's no obligation to call the cops, right? You see how this is tricky? So yeah, these are boundaries that operate in our society to protect people. The idea that you should not be a victim of assault or sexual assault. You should not be unlawfully confined. Yep, got that. But in order to enforce that, it requires typically a police action. And then that raises a puzzle about the healthcare provider's role. And I would say typically the rules of confidentiality beat the desire, I don't know what the right word would be, to report a criminal offence. So let's go to elder abuse. There is no such specific criminal offence in Canada. Age and abuse of trust can feature in sentencing. So that is, there's a whole bunch of case law where the sentences for fraud, for instance, has been increased when it's, the son defrauding his mother. That can increase the sentence because there's a breach of trust element there. So provincial oversight through guardianship legislation, I'll pick some of that up. There is a bit of a route to try to introduce some neutral third-party oversight to protect the vulnerable through guardianship legislation. I'm going to try and pick up this notion of vulnerability and enhanced vulnerability. But I want to suggest that just because I'm old doesn't make me more vulnerable. And even that leaves aside a question of what we should do about that increased vulnerability. So let's see if we can get there. So this is the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. These are guardianship investigations. So this is from their document called Guardianship Investigations from the OPGT. People concerned about an adult who may be mentally incapable here and at serious risk. So these are the thresholds. Can contact the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee. So mentally incapable, when they unpack that, it pretty closely maps onto the Healthcare Consent Act's understand and appreciate. So if you think about the way in which capacity is described in the Healthcare Consent Act, I need to be able to understand and appreciate the nature of the decision that I have in front of me. That's sort of, broadly speaking, transferable. That idea is transferable. However, one of the other things that the Healthcare Consent Act says is that we are capable unless we're not. So that is, we're all of us, I was going to say deemed, assumed, taken to be capable of making our own decisions, except when somebody with appropriate authority, the physician or the person proposing the treatment, has determined that I'm not capable. So you can contact the OPGT in cases where you think somebody is mentally incapable, and at serious risk. And the OPGT will conduct an investigation, and here's the crucial phrase, if no alternative solution can be found, and their wiggle room is in the alternative solution. So these are the alternative solutions for protecting people who are not capable of making their own decisions, and are in need of protection. So it could be a medical emergency, you know how that works. Could be treatment under the Mental Health Act, you know how that works. And there is a possibility for a court review of financial mismanagement by a person who holds a power of attorney. So a person who has the authority to make decisions on behalf of another, there can be a court review. But that needs to be prompted by somebody. Typically somebody who also has an interest in the financial dealings of the person concerned. This is straight from that OPGT document. This is a challenge. Personal autonomy and the right to make individual choices, even bad choices, are fundamental values in our society. But some people, due to illness, injury, or other causes, lack the mental capacity to make their own choices. So there's a lot hinging for OPGT on this mental capacity idea. As a result, they are extremely vulnerable to neglect, abuse, and exploitation. And I highlighted this. The key is finding the balance between respecting the rights of capable adults while protecting those who cannot protect themselves. So there's a ton of work being done by that concept of capable here, without much guidance as to what that might mean. So this is just unpacking that idea. It is from the Substitute Decisions Act. It's understand and appreciate. It's the same general idea. So we've said this. People are generally speaking free to live their lives as they choose. And I'll put it in green. Maybe I should have done the whole lot in different shades of grey. When can or should we interfere with another person's life? That's we've got the when must we, that's the mandatory requirement piece. But all of the hard cases are in the grey. All of the hard cases are cases where the person is not under the jurisdiction of a retirement home or a long-term care home, but where they're typically out living in the community. So when are we permitted to intervene? Maybe I'll put it that way. So Those of you that did the session we did last time on duties to restrain or confine would remember this. There is a common law duty of a caregiver, so this is lifted straight out of the Healthcare Consent Act, to restrain or confine a person when immediate action is necessary to prevent serious bodily harm to the person or to others. So the key features: immediate, necessary, serious bodily harm. And you'll notice that there's nothing there about capacity. So this is setting, I'd say, a pretty high bar. This is what you use, this common law duty, in your emergency department when you call security or where you call a code white and use hands-on interventions to subdue somebody who is, when there is immediate action that is necessary to prevent serious bodily harm to the person or to others. And then, of course, the next puzzle that I was in North Bay on Monday, and the conversation at the ethics committee was on what do you do in the emergency department when the person is waiting in the waiting room and has not yet been assessed by a physician. So they've come in, maybe expressing suicidal ideation. They've come in and it's a 10-hour wait. Under what circumstances would there be a requirement to prevent that person from leaving? They've been there for 4 hours and they say, I'm done, I'm out of here. They came in expressing suicidal ideation. They've not yet been seen by a physician, so you can't use the tools of the Mental Health Act. Can you restrain or confine them under this common law duty? And they had their security guys in, and they said this puts us in a really vulnerable position because in that organization it would be security that would hold somebody. So as soon as they do that, they're committing an offense under the criminal code. They're restraining, confining, committing an assault. So they feel profoundly vulnerable under those circumstances. Well, we know this. You've done this before. So other methods of restraining somebody, holding them, Mental Health Act, you know that. You can hold people under the terms of the Healthcare Consent Act when it's part of a course of treatment that has been consented to by either the patient or a substitute decision maker. Let's get to the harder stuff. So I've called this indirect interference. And now I'm sort of trying to capture this as protection of the vulnerable. So let me put the question like this. Under what conditions should we step in to protect people that are vulnerable? So we're talking about adults. We're worried about this business of capacity, but we're agreed that the person is vulnerable, particularly vulnerable. So we did a session maybe a year ago on this notion of vulnerability. We are vulnerable. All of us are vulnerable. All human life is conditioned by vulnerability as a result of our embodied, finite, and socially contingent existence. Vulnerability is thus an ontological condition of our humanity. It's lovely. This is who we are. We're people, and we are fragile. We're fragile to the physical world. We're fragile in our emotional worlds. We're fragile in our in our social conditions, and that's what it is to be human. The however is that some are more vulnerable than others. So the question becomes, well, okay, maybe I'll get to the question in the next one. Many of those vulnerabilities depend on where you are. It depends on the context. And here's the key piece. It demands an ethical response. And what we're talking about is a puzzle about what that ethical response would be when the person who is vulnerable is maybe living in their own home, embedded in their own family arrangements, maybe capable of making their own decisions, maybe not capable of making their own decisions, in a situation where they want to stay at home and live at home. But where they're profoundly vulnerable, and you as the external provider, the healthcare provider, is standing on the outside looking at the life of that individual. So what I'm trying to capture here is the idea that there is a special obligation on there is a special obligation on healthcare providers because they come with privilege, and because the people that you are working with in many situations are vulnerable, and that vulnerability is individual, depends on the particular person in the situation that they're in. We can unpack this in terms of fiduciary relationships, the idea that there's an obligation on the fiduciary to make decisions that are particularly protective of the people for whom they are making those decisions, or with whom they are making those decisions. And finally, there's a recognition that autonomy isn't just this on-off switch. It's not as simple as saying either I am or I'm not. And there's room for something like a notion of supported autonomy. How do we help people be as empowered as possible to make their own decisions? So that's a sort of a trust and dialogue based idea about the relationship. Sometimes this gets called a deliberative model of the caregiver-patient relationship, where deliberative means both sides of that, both parties of that relationship have got an obligation to connect, to engage with each other, to try to navigate their way through those. The understanding idea is that when you're dealing with people, you're dealing with people. You're dealing with individuals who have their own story. And if we're coming at this with in the elder abuse context, you're dealing with people who have a lifetime of story, they're not developing to something that will be new, fresh, open, and different. They're the people that you're dealing with often in these elder abuse type situations are people who are in the process of a slow, maybe not slow, but an inexorable decline towards death. And that's different from being a vulnerable kid who needs protection of their well-being in order to flourish. So, come back to that subjective view of what might be in a person's best interests, or that subjective view of abuse and neglect. The person's story, I think, is profoundly relevant to what would be abusive in this situation. So shared and supportive decision making can involve others, family members, trusted others. Things can change, and you're sort of stuck supporting that patient. I think this is patient-centered care. I think it's harm reduction. I think it's the necessity of trying to connect with that individual as they are. I don't know, kindness just seems seems like a good idea, and compassion, and with a view to empowering, to giving people as much control as they can manage over their own lives. And I think I'm prepared to say that irrespective of whether they're going to tick the box of capable or not capable. Go on then, back to our scenarios. You can put this in the chat. I'm just about done. Older adult patient lives with her older adult brother. Some staff believe that the brother is abusive. Reportable? I'm getting a shake of no. We've got no evidence whatsoever. Yeah, that's it. You should be putting those in there. We've got no evidence whatsoever that there's any abuse here, and there's no reason at all why you can't talk to the patient. Working out where a patient wants to go from the hospital I think it's really important. Even if they are maybe unrealistic about the things that they're able to do, their desires are significant. Resident from a long-term care home admitted with multiple pressure injuries, wounds, appears malnourished. Reportable? I've got one no and one yes. This could be a maybe, right? This I think is a prompt for further digging. Does that sound right? I mean, it could be that there are perfectly legitimate understandable reasons for that. For the condition of that patient. If that patient has been systematically refusing care, been pushing people away who've been coming in to try to provide the care, that could make a difference. Laura Lee.
If they're being admitted with these injuries and appears malnourished, so wouldn't that lead you to believe that it occurred outside of the facility?
So I think in this story, we're supposed to imagine that the person has come from the long-term care home and is admitted to your facility. Yes. So they sustained these, whatever they are, in their, this one is
in
a
a
long-term
care
yeah.
facility. Got you. So they've been admitted to a hospital from a long-term. Okay, yes, then it's reportable.
Darlene.
Sorry, I was just looking for the mute. I wonder about what is our obligation as a hospital in this particular scenario to either move to reporting versus having a conversation with, say, the DOC at the long-term care home.
Go on, I've got to go back to slide number 2. I think the obligation is to report to the Director of Care, right? That's where you go. So I think what you're doing exactly is having that conversation with the Director of Care. Does that make sense to you?
Very helpful, thank you.
And then finally, a family takes a patient out of their retirement home. Patient isn't capable. The family's not providing the basic necessities for the patient. The patient has now been admitted. And then they say, well, you can't send her back to the retirement home because she hasn't got any money. But you know that the patient does. What are your thoughts there? I'm getting frowns. Look, I think this is what's really tricky about this one is a puzzle about the extent to which a hospital, healthcare providers, have got an obligation to look out for the financial interests of the person that they are dealing with. So I would say, the family is not entitled to take the poor patient's income for their own purposes. It's going to make discharge planning challenging. But the key piece, I think, the challenge for the hospital organization is to ensure that, I'm going to put this, so OPGD consultation, maybe you're moving ahead with the discharge plan and the family is going to have to work it out with the retirement home. So you've got a sort of a couple of challenges. One of them is that hospitals are not residential facilities. They're not a place for a person to live. But sometimes, it feels as if the hospital gets sort of saddled with those sorts of situations. All right. Questions, comments, your thoughts? By all means, your thoughts for something that we should do next. Any other suggestions? And here are there's an evaluation, standard evaluation there. If you click on that, you'll go there. And if you want a certificate of participation, you can go to the other QR code, and that'll take you there, and we'll send those off to you. Any other comments? Well, then I think
I was just going to say, I thought your point around the children, thinking of elders like children, was a really good one. I mean, it's really making me think, because I think sometimes we do think of them as a very vulnerable population that we need to protect in the same way, and it's a balance of that, right? Because they sometimes their autonomy, they're still making a choice that's putting them at high risk. It's a hard thing to kind of think through.
I think it's really hard, and I do think that the objects of the legislation really do help us to think our way through that. The object of the child welfare legislation is to protect the well-being and best interests of children. But that's not the Healthcare Consent Act. I mean, the Healthcare Consent Act could have said that. It could have said, this is a bill to protect the interests of patients, or the best interests, or the well-being. It didn't. So how does my autonomy, exercised through a lifetime, carry forward into my increasing vulnerability, my declining capacity? So the number of, I would say, a significant area of current consults concerns, let's call it the safety of a discharge for a vulnerable patient back to their home. So the number of stories where the relationship's terrible. She's really mean to him, but she's probably always been really mean to him. And when does it reach the threshold? And he wants to go home, and it's his home. Even if he's not capable, he wants to go home. She might be this and that, but she's my this and that. So that's an intertwining and an expression of that person's life, autonomy, independence through a lifetime. And it's not the same. He's not vulnerable in the same way that a child is vulnerable. So yeah, no, thank you, Catherine. I do think it is an important point to think our way through. Any other takers? Well, thank you. Thanks for making the time. Look out for the next one. We'll be back again, I think probably in September, October, something like that. And I think I want to do something on an infection prevention and control approach to moral distress. So if you think that's fun, send me a message. And but I'm just a little worried that there's no way I can do it in an hour. I think we need 3 hours to do that any justice. So we might have to do it as a workshop. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see if we get any interest there. Thanks to all of you. Bye.